in case you missed it, last week was another moment where Ron Rivera put his goddamn foot in his mouth. He did it last year with the what's the difference between you and the rest of the teams in the NFC East? And he said quarterback. And at the time, Daniel Jones was like not considered a good quarterback in the NFL, which made it equal, like especially insulting to the quarterbacks on his roster. But now he's done it again. This time, around the same time he did this last year, he's decided, I'm going to throw Eric Bieniemy under the bus, my new assistant head coach, my new offensive coordinator, who comes from a pretty storied culture, pretty successful team. I don't know if you guys have heard of the Kansas City Chiefs and Patrick Mahomes, but Eric Bieniemy was his offensive coordinator and has 2 rings to show for it. And yet, Ron Rivera decided he was going to side with players, and normally that's okay with me, right? But players who were going behind their offensive coordinator's back to talk to Ron Rivera and say, Eric Bieniemy's working us too hard. And this is the kind of thing you hash this out internally, right? This is the kind of thing that you say, hey, I'm the head coach, you're the assistant head coach. Maybe we need to kind of tone things down or blend our styles. But instead, Rivera chose to publicly undermine him. And Ron Rivera, in my opinion, is a lame duck head coach. New ownership. The guy's barely won anything. Cam Newton carried him to that Super Bowl. And he's trying to save his ass by throwing his potential replacement under the bus. That's my read on this. What's your read? Take a listen.
Going back to Bienemy and his intensity, have players had to kind of adapt to that and have any, I guess, sort of struggled with that at times?
Yeah, I mean they have, and one of the biggest things is and I had a number of guys come to me and I say, hey, just go talk to him. I said, understand what he's trying to get across to you, and I think as they go and they talk and they listen to him, it's been enlightening for a lot of these guys. I mean, it's a whole different approach. You get a different kind of player from the players back in the past, especially in light of how things are coming out of college football. So a lot of these young guys, they do struggle with certain things. And a lot of y'all's got to take for where they've been. I mean, guys coming from certain programs are used to it. Guys come from other programs aren't as much. So, us as a coach, I kind of have to assimilate and get a feel for everybody. Eric has an approach, and it's the way he does things, and he's not going to change. And because he believes in it, Jack has his approach. Having been a head coach, I think Jack has a tendency to try and figure guys out a little bit more, as opposed to, hey, this is it, this is the way it's going to be, that type of stuff. Where Eric hasn't had that experience yet.
And just that when they came to you, it's just they felt like Eric was riding them too hard, or?
Well, they just were.
There were more. There's more to those comments, but not much. He kind of just gets a little nervous there. But to me, this is what's interesting. Like, look, Eric Bieniemy may be an old school football coach who is demanding of his players. You know who's old school? Bill Belichick. You know who's old school apparently? Andy Reid. Andy Reid's really tough, according to a lot of players in practices. That's why Eric Bieniemy was his offensive coordinator. You know who's old school? Mike Vrabel. You know who's old school? I don't know. I could go down the list of guys who are notoriously tough in practice. But they're white guys, so it's fine. It's fine.
Well, that's what I don't understand is because usually a lot of times this is seen as like an honorific almost. Like if you have that intensity in practice, if you work your guys, if you kind of bust their ass a little bit, it's almost seen as like you have this mentality as a coach that like every play, even if it's whether it's in pads or not, a scrimmage, a preseason game, like having that intensity kind of like either riding your players or pushing them to be better. There's a lot of like generic pablum surrounding like being an intense and a kind of like forthright and locked in coach like that, that's not usually seen either A, as a pejorative, or B, kind of like used as like press conference fodder by by a head coach about a coordinator. It seems a little bit
Coaches never talk about their coordinators.
that's I think the other thing that's kind of surprising about it is, like, even though obviously Rivera, you know, Bienemy's coming in from another team. He, like, Ron Rivera didn't, like, I don't think necessarily, like, it wasn't a guy that Ron Rivera brought on his staff, like, when he was hired by the Commanders or anything like that. But I feel like once, even if it seems silly by virtue of it being kind of just like a uniform change, I do feel like on football teams, that's pretty much like, oh, like, we now are protectionist of this guy. We don't create a further bit of controversy or potential kindling for something else to be questioned about him. And Rivera
there's already been so much questioned about him.
Absolutely. He missed out on the coaching cycle. He missed out on a head coaching cycle twice in a row, basically.
He is the portrait for a black coordinator not getting a fair shake. And let's be real here. I take the players at their word. Tyreek Hill tweeted, Tyreek Hill's crazy, okay? And he tweeted in his defense saying he's a tough, like, SOB. I'm paraphrasing, but he'll make you better. Just trust me. Patrick Mahomes has said glowing things about him, and Patrick Mahomes is one of the mentally most tough quarterbacks in the league, if not the most mentally tough, and Bienemy had a huge part in that. I mean, and a Jamal Charles tweet now in defense of him. The problem that I think is that Ron Rivera has been a cozy ass, laid back guy and has not whipped his guys into shape. They have had issues finishing seasons. They have started off okay, right? And I know that there hasn't been the best talent there, but on the defensive side, they have a lot of talent, and Rivera's supposed to be a defensive head coach. So let Bienemy run his offense, because the problem with the Commanders for a while is they've not been tough. They've not had a good end to their seasons. And that's maybe in part due to the fact that Rivera, you don't see an issue with, like, actually creating a culture of championships and winning, and that's what Bienemy knows how to do.
And also, I will say, like, I think it is a testament to, like, you know, Tyreek Hill and Patrick Mahomes are de facto the two of the biggest stars in the NFL.
Yeah,
they wouldn't necessarily, if they didn't say anything about these about his comments or about or if they haven't ever said anything.
I don't know if Mahomes said anything.
No, I know.
Directly,
I guess not Mahomes not in response to this, but I mean,
but
just generally about him.
Yeah.
I think it says something that even, like, a star like Tyreek Hill would come out in defense of Bienemy in this regard. Also, while not being on his team anymore, in the sense of not even being on the Chiefs before Bienemy left for Washington. The other thing that I think is kind of interesting about this is just knowing what the perception of Rivera was going into his tenure with the Commanders and what we've actually seen from him as head coach, in the sense that in the middle of the turbulence of the twilight years or moments of the Snyder administration, heading into a kind of an inevitable sale and investigation disclosures and things like that, it was Riverboat Ron. We're gonna get a steward for our organization, a guy who's kind of no nonsense and just knows how to coach a team. And this guy last year, as you said, is throwing his own basically saying his quarterback play is terrible, so that's why they can't compete. Relative to guys like Daniel Jones, who obviously, of course, as me and you have always attested, took a step up. But, like, the fact that you're basically saying we're in elite quarterback territory with Daniel Jones, it's like, okay, like, that seems like that not only seems like a bluff, it also seems like poor scouting on his part, to a degree. Then, as I'm not sure if you remember, of course, him basically not even realizing that the Commanders were at risk of being eliminated from playoff contention at the end of the season until a reporter enlightened him of it. I don't really think the common sense steward, who's kind of supposed to just have, like, a even keel, like, to kind of right the ship, maybe he should know what the freaking playoff scenarios are.
Totally.
So I'm just thinking also, it's like, this to me, what this was ostensibly supposed to be, I think, for me at least, is really souring me on this guy. And I know he's been through a lot. He was undergoing cancer treatment. Like, I feel for him. I sympathize with him. I don't necessarily even think he's a bad guy. I just think, like, there are many things about being a coach that require, I think, a lot of like extroverted qualities, but I also think there's something really important about using discretion and not allowing stuff like this to come out, and not allowing there to be even the perception that you were kind of railroading your guy for being too intense when we don't care usually if people are being too intense.
No.
Usually, and I mean, as like an NFL viewing public don't care. Usually it's like, oh wow, that guy's crazy. Like Dan Campbell's so intense, his nose is so red because he doesn't wear coats outside. He's screaming at these players and he's crying in the press conferences because he cares so much.
Good,
usually,
that's a better example. Yeah, right.
Usually that stuff is like, this guy would do anything for football and he's crazy about it. And here he's basically saying he's kind of like he's never been a head coach, so he doesn't know the ins and outs of working with players, which I don't even think is necessarily
No, but
true.
Jack Del Rio does.
But Jack Del
That's
Rio,
who he's referring to.
Jack Del Rio also is like
basically stormed the freaking Capitol.
Yeah,
That's
right.
his ideology.
Like,
yeah. That guy knows how to that guy knows how to relate to Duran Payne and like black players on his. I mean, I'm just picking a player.
No, of course.
But I mean, give me a freaking break.
That intensity is okay though.
That
tweeting about like January 6th. And
that
stuff.
makes me very mad. I mean, that makes me mad. And
because think of the parallel. Think of the parallel between a guy like Eric Bieniemy, what he's succeeded at, what he's won with the most successful franchise of the last decade, and what Jack Del Rio's done. Jack Del Rio was a failed head coach for the Raiders.
Oh, totally.
I think, of course, I think he's a good defensive mind, regardless of his political proclivities.
He's fine.
But the front seven that was supposed to be extremely ferocious and vaunted going into the 2021 season was massively disappointing.
Yeah.
Like,
I mean,
the
what
Payne,
has
Jonathan Allen,
what has he proved?
Right. The Duran Payne, Jonathan Allen, Ryan Kerrigan, Montez Sweat front four was supposed to literally be the best front four in football, and they weren't.
Yeah.
And that was before Eric Bieniemy was on the staff. I know he's not a defensive mind, but I'm saying what does that say about the leadership that was there prior?
I totally agree with you. It's not a coincidence that Ron Rivera and Dave Gettleman were the GM and coach combo in Carolina. I'll just say that they both love to deflect blame onto other people. So it all roads lead back to me hating Dave Gettleman. But I mean that's another side. Another aside. But I think it speaks to what you're saying though. That I think almost he's feeling threatened.
There are certain things almost that I also will say, kind of with the benefit of hindsight, seeing how the Panthers fared after this. I also kind of think the 15-1 season, the Super Bowl season, sort of like padded Rivera's reputation enough to give him a more of a half-life as like a respected or sort of like a coach that has kept up with the league for longer than maybe he actually is capable of.
And that was a result of Cam Newton being Superman.
Right.
That was Cam Newton. That was his MVP season. And then, they ended up losing in the Super Bowl because that Denver defense was so phenomenal. But
and then they weren't good the next year.
No.
They were bad.
They had a drop-off. They're not a disciplined team, and he's pissed off that Eric Bieniemy is providing discipline to his players, and then he's allowing for these players to go behind their coach's back and talk crap.
And then launder it when the press is asking, which I just think is, listen, I think it's great. I honestly think it's clarifying for me to know that Rivera would say something like this, but as a coach, I wouldn't. I would say that's between me and the players and me and Eric.
Exactly.
That's what you say.
That's all you have to say, unless you're trying to publicly undermine him because you are terrified of losing your job.
And I think
there's a new owner. And that's exactly what it is.
Totally. I really don't think we can underestimate that at all, because as you're saying, new ownership, there might be another name change for this organization. Like there is the idea or the prospect that Josh Harris is going to want a clean slate for the team he just purchased.
Of course he does. And the fact that Bienemy hasn't been hired yet has been an embarrassment for the league, and Harris could make some people happy from a PR perspective by hiring Bienemy. That's the politics of things behind the scenes, and I think he's more than earned it as the offensive coordinator for the Chiefs for that long. And the reason he took this job and left was because he knew this was the only way he was going to get an opportunity.
To literally prove that he could
that it's not just Reed, and it's not just, and it's not
a quality
just,
offense without the people who I guess are perceived as almost his crutches, which is like, I think, an unfair assessment. Joseph White in the YouTube chat did make a great point. As you know, who we haven't mentioned, funnily enough, as a guy who's perceived as tough and it's absolutely revered, Mike Tomlin.
Oh, totally.
And you know what? The reason why you don't have anyone from the Rooney family or the GM of the Steelers being like, he's a bit of a hard ass, is because he's a winner and they respect winners in the process of winners.
And the Steelers are just classy.
And clearly Ron Rivera and like, doesn't feel that way about Bienemy's pedigree,
Yeah.
and I wonder why. And I'm really not trying to make that speculation about Rivera himself being like a racist, but I think like this stuff is unconscious.
Of course. Rivera's employed Jack Del Rio. He saw no problem with that.
Right.
I mean, to me, that's a red flag. I would never let that guy near my players. I want guys that are not going to be like actively freaking, conservative dick bags around my majority black locker room. Sorry.
I just think sometimes the simplest thing to think about when we talk about like race in sports, especially, is literally just like, it's not even counterfactual, because we have examples where you can like plug in the avatars of like the white example of a certain phenomenon and a black example of a certain phenomenon, and there being an entire schematic and like semiotic like interpretation of what phrases are qualified and associated with those people.
Yeah.
Like where a scrappy white guy is like, the guy first one in, last one out, the hard-nosed guy, and that same scrappy black guy is like a junkyard dog. I wonder, like, why is that?
Yeah.
Like, and I think, and it's the same thing with stuff like this, that like Bienemy's a little aggressive and goes a little too far with these things, and yet Dan Campbell doesn't. Dan Campbell's just doing what he knows how to do. He just knows how to be intense and get the most out of his players. All of this stuff has code. All of this stuff has like unconscious bias embedded within it, and we're just seeing that
100%
from a guy who also, by the way, is a person of color. Ron Rivera, by the way,
Yeah.
it knows no bounds.
Yeah.